Welcome to Books and the World, a production of the Cape Cod Writers Center. Books and the World is the longest running book-oriented show on cable TV, many decades. The Cape Cod Writers Center celebrated its 50th anniversary some years ago. So my name is Hugh Blair-Smith, and my guest today is Marty Sandler, who has written so many books that we put one up right over here so that he will remember which one we're talking about today.
Thank you.
So that seems only fair. Let me just start off by summarizing a little bit of what's in this book. First of all, the history books that I had when I was a kid didn't look like this at all. No. If you ever saw a picture, it was a great rarity. And here we have a lot of really splendid archival photographs. But there are six main stories about the year 1919 that Marty is telling us. The first one is an amazing event that began early in the year. And for each of these stories, I'm going to give you a little 1.5 word theme. Okay. And in this case, the theme is reckless greed. There's many things, but that's one of them. The second part is about suffrage, women's suffrage, which came to essentially practical completion in that year. And of course, that is a story of perseverance. The third one is Red Summer, and the theme is fear and racism. And we'll talk quite a bit about that one. Then there's the Red Scare, which was a big thing in 1919, and that, of course, is about fear of communism. And then there's a lot of strikes, major movement in the labor movement, and that I'm going to call fear of class from the manager's point of view. Right. And then Prohibition, of course, which was the fear of alcohol. So something in 1919, when we should have been feeling triumphant, made us feel fearful. Mm-hmm. And that's a theme I would like to come back to a little bit. Tell us a little bit about why you chose 1919 as the year to focus on.
Well, it's an extraordinary year, I mean, in American history. And I used the subtitle, The Year That Changed America. And it's not hyperbole. It's really right. True. I mean, I think it's the beginning of modern America. I mean, you have this one year in which women get the vote, and you have the same year Prohibition comes in, the same year you have more lynchings and more racial riots than at any time in our history, and yet in the same time the Civil Rights Movement is born. And with all that going on, there are other kinds of things going on. I wish I had 800 pages to work on this book because, for example, this is the year in which 275,000 Americans die of the flu, the greatest medical epidemic, greater than the Great Plague. Yeah. This is the year in which two people I had never heard of until I did the research, John Alcock and Arthur Brown, fly nonstop across the Atlantic 8 years before Lindbergh. This is the year when the greatest sports scandal of all time, the Black Sox scandal, takes place. So when I looked at that, I said, well, I got to do that book. But the other thing that struck me as I went further into the research, and it's all about the research, the thing that really struck me was that how they're connected. The same, and for example, one of the most interesting stories, the grabby story in this book, is about the Great Molasses Flood, where people die and the railroad system is destroyed by a 45-foot wave of molasses, believe it or not. Oh. And yet, as I'm reading through it, and after it's over, and the Red Cross people and the firemen and the policemen are digging through the rubble, trying to find survivors, all the church bells in Boston are going off in celebration. And I said, what's that all about? And it was because at that very moment, New Mexico had become the last state to ratify Prohibition, and people who are in favor of Prohibition are celebrating. So it's really wild. The connections and the relevancy to today is also really struck me. I mean, I've always been fascinated by this whole conflict between personal liberty and the public good. And we go through it all the time. I mean, it's amazing how many people today would go to jail before they'd let their kids get vaccinated.
Yeah.
And yet, the government's dictating they should.
Right.
So for all those reasons, you know, as you said, I've done an awful lot of books, but I've never done a book in which so many things happened in 1 year.
Yeah. Well, it's a very impressive year, and it's a very impressive book. I really enjoyed that a great deal, and I certainly wish that when when I was a kid, that I'd had anything similar to that. One thing that struck me, well, let me start a little earlier here about the amazing event, the Molasses Flood, which happened early in the year. And what you do, of course, you tie it to the fact that Prohibition was sort of rumbling down the tracks at the time. In fact, it pulled into its station at that time. And the people who were in the molasses business, of course, they go back, speaking of civil rights as we will from time to time, to the role of molasses in the triangle trade. Molasses and slaves and rum.
Right, all connected.
All connected. And of course, I think perhaps our irresistible lust for rum was perhaps the fuel, the sort of spiritual fuel that drove a great deal of that. So with Prohibition coming, the people who were in the molasses business said, "Okay, we've got to store up a lot of molasses and sell it real quick before it's too late to do that anymore."
That's right.
So they could have gotten an engineer, but they got some nobody who didn't know anything to design this riveted tank, which was bigger than any molasses tank had ever been.
That's right.
And they also forgot that if you're going to fill a tank with liquid in the winter, you've got to be aware of expansion when things warm up a little bit. And generally, they forgot everything that any sensible engineer would know about.
That's right.
So that's why that tank burst on that day and released how many gallons, roughly?
Oh, like millions and millions of gallons. Yeah, I'm sorry, I forget the exact number, but millions of gallons in an enormous wave. Yeah, and you had given themes to it. Your theme with the word greed in it is absolutely right on you because, you know, there's this United States Alcohol Company. They're trying to make as much money. It's not only, interestingly enough, not only the rum connection, but World War I is ending. And, you know, amazingly, molasses is a key ingredient in munitions. So they're going to lose that business as well. And so you have a January week, and starting in the 15th, in which on one day it is 20 degrees, and it's almost like today on the Cape. The next day it's 55, and you get this expansion that you talked about. And it burst, and people got killed, and homes got destroyed, and the elevated railroad system came down. I mean, at first it's kind of, when you first talk to people about the molasses, when you first mention it, they start to laugh. I mean, you know, death by molasses, but it's not funny. And it's not one of the most important stories. And if I were to criticize myself on this, now this book won the National Book Award, so I'm not going to do much criticism.
Good.
But on the other hand, if I was to give a criticism, I say I probably should have spent more time on a national event like the flu rather than a local event but on the other hand, the other thing that I'm proud about in this book, and thank goodness the reviewers have picked that up, is that we draw in each of the stories, we draw a parallel to today.
Right.
And the parallel with the Molasses Act is that when that tank went up, there was not one building code in the United States. We had never heard of such a thing.
Right.
It's a result of this that you get the first building codes.
Yeah.
You get the first laws that say you got to have an architect. You got to have blueprints. You got to have the government oversight on anything of that magnitude that you build. Right. So that makes it a very important and very timely story.
It is, and between that and it's being a suitable introduction for a year full of fantastic stuff.
That's right.
It's very good. One of the little details that impressed me most was there was a fellow who the molasses pushed him through some sort of a factory building and burst the wall, pushed him right into the harbor, and somebody on a boat was passing by and rescued him.
Yeah, there's great stories about. That's right. There's
now,
enormous
one of the things that we teach in a boating organization that I belong to is it's very, very hard to pull somebody up out of the water. there ought to be at least two of you working on it, and I don't think there were in this case.
No, I mean, it's
Somebody between adrenaline and muscles managed to do this rescue, which would be impossible under anything resembling normal circumstances. So that was kind of typical of that. Anyhow, let's move on a little bit to women's suffrage. And this is, of course, one of the places, I think in the Molasses story, you don't really have much of an individual hero or an individual mover. But of course, in women's suffrage, there are some very heroic women, and you do give them good words and good pictures.
And it's a heroic story. I mean, I had never realized until I did the research that the way they finally, there's so many interesting things I had never known until I did the research. For example, that years before all this, the women in the territories in the West had gotten the vote. And it's very simple why they got the vote, because they're working side by side with the men. The men need them, number one. And number two, you can't say they're dumb, and you can't say they're frail, and you can't say they're going to faint when they get to the polls, as they did later on, because these women are everything but that. But it's an extraordinary story, and there are great heroines. And what I had also never, and the big part of it all is, it took all the suffering they did. It took all the abuse, by physical abuse, they suffered as they picketed the White House for the first time in history. As they staged the largest march Washington had ever seen and got attacked. As they did all this thing, the physical abuse they took, as they got put in jail and were force-fed when they went on their hunger strikes, when the rest of the country read all about that and saw that's what got them the vote. And it wasn't Carrie Nation going in with her hatchets, breaking down the things. The other thing that's fascinating to me, I had never realized the amount of alcoholism that was taking place in this country. When the Pilgrims came over here, there were 100 times more bottles of liquor on that boat than there were bottles of water.
Water is poisonous. Beer is good for you.
And I remember as a kid being fascinated and thrilled by the story of Johnny Appleseed, and he was bouncing around giving everybody apples. Baloney, he was giving them orchards to make hard cider out of, So there's an understanding of why it came about, but it's very hard to believe that a nation can make laws that say you cannot buy liquor, you cannot sell liquor, you cannot transport liquor. But it went on for a long time. There's so many great things that come out of this story. I mean, it's the birth of the American gangster. Has there ever been a greater character to write about or to see in movies than the American gangster? It's the beginning. It's a whole change in the life of women. Until this, women have never go into a bar. Ever. Now they're in speakeasies drinking, And then there are these incredible stories. I mean, more people joined the Catholic Church and joined the Jewish synagogues than at any time in our history. And why? Because one of the loopholes in the law was that rabbis and priests could dispense liquor. So it's a wonderful story. There's a very human story.
Absolutely. And certainly one of the most remarkable things that you reveal is that some of the propaganda against women's suffrage is that women who go into the voting booth will faint dead away from the stress.
That's exactly right.
So it's just typical of a lot of seriously fake ideas.
Well, fake ideas are not new.
That have had a distressingly large hold on our country and indeed on the world.
That's right.
But let's move on to Red Summer. Now, Red Summer is a phrase I must have seen somewhere, but it was new to me as a phrase.
Yeah, I'm forgetting the name of the author, but who I think wrote the main book and then called it Red Summer, but it's not new with him. And the red stands for blood. And there were more lynchings and more. And there are three main places where it takes place all over the country, but in Chicago, it begins in Chicago, where the young black boy is swimming, and it's a typical beach at that time in America where there's a rope right down the middle, and blacks are to stay here, and they're never to cross that line. And the tide takes him under the ropes, and the whites start stoning him from the beach. And the police are called, and as they get there, do they arrest the people who were stoning? No, they arrest the blacks. And
Right.
So it's we've seen outrages equally bad today.
Yeah.
But it's the beginning of one of the great race riots in our history. But then you have race riots in Washington that break out, and they're distinguished by the fact that for the first time blacks organize and they get their own guns and they start fighting back.
Right.
And then the biggest one of all takes place in Arkansas, in which there are sharecroppers. Now, sharecropping was just another fancy name for slavery that continued.
For sure.
And these sharecroppers have the nerve, these black sharecroppers have the nerve to want to have a union because they're getting paid unliving wages.
Right.
And so the whites start attacking them, and then the whites, who are determined to put them down, they start bringing in groups from Mississippi, armed groups from Mississippi, and it turns into a bloodbath.
Yeah.
And it's a very, very difficult time. One of the things I wrestled with in this book, I got in the baseball scandal, and I got in this wonderful story of these guys flying the Atlantic for the first time. But I did not want to make it a downer.
Right.
And there are a lot of just negative things that happen, but they all, and I didn't make that up, they all have an ending in which leads to something very positive. And that's another tremendous, I mean, I hope Hollywood is watching, because this would make a great movie.
Of course it would. And certainly the whole Red Summer chapter contains, I picked out 2 pictures of this book that really moved me.
Okay.
And one of them, and I think we were able to show it on the screen here, is about a bunch of white men in Chicago, all with bricks in their hands, and they're going to
hunting for any black face they can find, and
any
they're
black face.
Do mayhem.
And that's I mean, I sort of knew that kind of thing went on, but that picture really kind of brought it home. So
well, you made a very good point at the beginning, when you talked about the history books that we had when we were kids were not like this, and the fact that I never let anybody else pick the pictures from my book, and I do a tremendous amount of picture research because I think the old corny phrase that a picture's worth 1,000 words. Many times it is. And there are extraordinary pictures of this period. It's a hard period.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Let me move on to the other red part, the Red Scare, which of course we've had from time to time. But that was, of course, the time when the Bolsheviks took over in Russia and murdered the Tsar's family and generally suggested that Russia's role in the world was to make everybody knuckle under to communism.
Yeah, well, you got 2 things going on. You got people absolutely convinced that the Russian sympathizers or the Russians themselves are coming here, and that we are going to be converted to communism. But this is really, it's a story of this is not. We're not living through the first anti-immigrant period in our history.
By no means,
And they were convinced, these people all over the country are convinced that these immigrants are here to take over, for the communists and so forth. And so you've got, and it's really the beginnings of the McCarthy era that we lived through.
Absolutely.
And so you've got this guy Palmer, who is the Attorney General of the United States. He's a latter day or an earlier day, Joe McCarthy, and he's absolutely carrying out raids without warrants, without subpoenas. He's putting people in jail with no evidence. A lot of it took place in Boston, on those islands out on Castle Island, the islands off of Boston. He's deporting people. You've heard that phrase recently.
We have.
He's deporting people with no cause. So it's a terrible, terrible time. Now, again, though, I will say that justice prevails and reason prevails, and eventually, I mean, he came very close to being nominated for president of the United States because he became a hero to a lot of people.
Okay.
But finally, he was found out, and finally, the injustice was corrected. But it's a tough person, and that it would come in the same year of all these other incredible events going on.
So we hit bottom in a number of dimensions and had to start climbing up because there wasn't
There was no way to go but up. That's right.
Okay, let me move on a little bit to the labor movement and all the strikes. And I guess what you're saying is that the business of doing big-time strikes really advanced significantly in that year. Is that fair to say?
Also it's a continuation of the Red Scare because they're accusing the immigrants of fostering the strike, and there were a lot of immigrants involved. And in every single case in 1919, when the police are called in, they do not side with the strikers who are striking because they're working under terrible conditions, and they're getting paid next to nothing, and they're being abused at the workplace. But no, it's always the owners that they side with.
Right.
And there are just the thing that always struck me about everything I did in this book is that the human side, which is I have devoted my life to trying to make history come alive. And when you get topics like this one, it becomes kind of easy.
Yeah.
And there's such human stuff. I mean, one of the great strikes that takes place is the Boston police strike in 1919. And it's a strike, as I say in the book, it's a strike that made a president, because in this strike, now the Boston police are underpaid. They're working in terrible conditions. They're being asked to work 20 hours a day. And so they go on strike. But it's the first time in history that a public organization, a government organization, has gone on strike. And you have the governor of Massachusetts, Calvin Coolidge, and what does he do? He runs away. He doesn't want to have anything to do with this.
Right.
But in running away, before he leaves, he makes one statement.
Yes.
He says there is no right any time for anybody to strike against the government.
Right.
And it just strikes a chord, and I quoted that badly, but he strikes a chord with a nation, and he becomes president of the United States.
Yeah.
And there are all those kind of things that are going on at the same time.
Yeah.
It's a turning point in labor unions.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how in this 1 year there are so many turning points. I could have called the book Turning Points. I mean, there are so many turning points that go on. Now, the other thing is I have to just tell you this story quickly. One of the reasons that I did this book, or one of the things that caused this book, is that publishers have always been nuts about anniversaries.
Yeah.
Can you find a topic that's a 50th anniversary or 100? Well, I wrote the book in 2019. I always just pro forma look at what's the, and I never find anything, but I do it for their sake.
Right.
And also, I must tell you, I've sold a lot of books in my career. I've never sold 10 books, I don't think, because it's an anniversary, but they're obsessed with it.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at 1919, and I said, oh my goodness, all of this is taking place.
Yeah.
And one of the things that got me was how all of these strikes, the police strikes, so many important strikes, the first great coal strike, take place in this year, along with everything else.
Yeah. Okay. And of course, we talked a little bit earlier about Prohibition. I'd just like to make an observation here that of your 6 big stories, the amazing events, Suffrage, Red Summer, Red Scare, strikes, and Prohibition, on 5 of those, you have a little section called 100 Years Later.
Right.
You talked about that a little bit before.
Right.
And so what difference has it made over the past 100 years? And it's always made some, often not as much as it should.
You mean the Prohibition one? Well,
yeah.
I think the biggest thing, this is where you really do come into this whole conflict between the personal liberty and the public good.
Yeah.
I mean, does the government have a right to tell Hugh and Marty that you better wear a seatbelt or we're going to fine you? Okay?
Yep.
I think, is that a violation of my liberty?
Yeah.
Is it a violation of my personal liberty if they tell me you're going to go to jail if you don't wear a helmet while you're riding your motorcycle?
Yep.
And as I said earlier, or that you may not smoke there.
Right.
What right have you got to tell me that I can smoke?
Yeah.
And there are people that take that very serious, the most serious one. And
Right.
I didn't realize until I got into the research that how serious it is in certain parts of the country is this whole vaccination thing. I mean,
Yeah.
I had my kids vaccinated. I wouldn't think about not having my kids vaccinated, but
Yeah.
there are people who really believe that it's a physical danger, and there have been cases where vaccinations have caused death. But beyond that, and you had some very important people. You've had Robert Kennedy, who has led the charge in many ways, against that. So it's a real issue, and it's always going to be a real issue, and it really does begin with Prohibition, and And I think Prohibition is just a very, very fascinating subject
It
because
is.
there's so much to it.
You could write a whole book on that if you
Well,
haven't
there's
already.
a guy named Daniel Okrent who's one of
Okay.
the great writers who's done that.
Let me move on to another observation here. There are the 6 big stories. I have here a list of about 15 of your little stories.
That's great.
And if this was a magazine, these would have been sidebars.
Yep.
Only yours are bigger than sidebars. They're 2-pagers and a few are 3 pages.
Yep.
And I think that's a terrific, good way to organize
Oh, thank you.
a
Yeah.
book. So we have one about immigrants. We have molasses. We have a year. You have some. Here's all the stuff that happened in 1919. It's a sort of turmoil
Other
and
than
triumph.
that we deal with, yeah.
Right. And the one about what the people who were opposed to suffrage were thinking about.
Yeah, and that that's a huge movement. That the anti-suffrage, including some women, a lot of women. So.
Yeah. And you have the double jeopardy of African American women. And you have a sort of some year-by-year summaries of basically of civil rights. And then you do, by way of putting in a positive one, you gave us a couple of pages on the New Negro, the Harlem Renaissance.
Good.
A lot of
one could say
first
one should
clue.
do a book on
Yeah.
Harlem, which has been done,
Yeah.
but
Right.
it's an amazing. You get some of the great writers in
Yeah.
our history coming
Yeah.
out of that movement. You get some of the great playwrights. You get some of the great actors and actresses. And it's the beginning of the civil rights movement and beyond, where for the first time African Americans are not totally afraid to speak out. So that's an important part of it.
It is. We have, of course, the communist business and McCarthy, just a little short subject sidebars on that. The American Civil Liberties Union, which is obviously central to so much of your story.
Yeah.
And then you put Alcock and Brown into a place where it almost doesn't fit, but you couldn't possibly leave it out.
Well, and it's a we could talk about publishing for a little bit. I had originally written Alcock and Brown as one of the top 6 ones as a full story.
But what I'd like to do, I'd like to see if we can throw in the photograph of the Alcock and Brown plane, the Vimy, after it landed in the Irish bog and it was down on its nose.
Yep.
As just a fascinating picture. It's so much evocative of what was different about
what
aviation.
happened is Alcock, the pilot, after all they had been through, and this guy walking out on the wings, chipping away ice 4 different times, when they finally find green grass to land on, he thinks it's green grass, it's a bog.
It's a bog,
and so the whole thing ends in a crash. But they're the first to fly, and they become enormous heroes. And again, there's the human part, which always gets to me. 1 month. No, excuse me, less than a month after they become the greatest of all aviation heroes, Alcock goes up to test pilot a plane and he crashes into a tree and dies. And I end that story with Brown, who was his navigator, never setting foot in a plane again. I mean, because they had become so close.
Okay. Well, anyhow, it's a fascinating book with the big stories and the little stories that pepper it. I'd like to thank you very much for joining us today on Books in the World.
Interview. Thank you.